ending load shedding, prioritising economic recovery, tackling unemployment and putting a stop to corruption. All the usual suspects were present in the ANC's January 8th statement as delivered by the President. Good sentiments, but can the governing party actually deliver? Let's unpack the statement now with political analyst Sanusha Naidu, who joins us as always from Cape Town. Sanusha, thanks so much for your time. We've had more than 24 hours to digest the January 8th statement, but very much just a fuller, more fledged out stump speech from President Cyril Ramaphosa. We all know what the focus areas need to be: ending load shedding, economic recovery, employment for the youth, getting rid of the bad apples in the party, and the list goes on. What was different, I found, this time around are those tasks or priorities and action points that the President named in that speech to say, this is what we need to focus on and this is what we're going to do. So a little less vague than what we've come to expect from his stump speech. What was your opinion about that speech?
Good evening, Marcel. Good evening to the viewers, and all the best for 2023. I think that when you look at the speech, you kind of get the sense that there's a lot of familiarity in the speech, in what you said, in terms of the fact that you have the usual action points or the usual points that we need to talk about: the economic crisis, the electricity or energy crisis, the question of poverty, inequality, unemployment. He brought in the viability of municipalities and the status quo of municipalities in terms of where they were yesterday in delivering the January 8th statement. And that was in Mangaung, where we know that that's one of those very, very dire, constrained municipalities in terms of the socioeconomic dimensions, but it's also across most of the municipalities in terms of where they are with their spending, how are they actually meting out the kind of services to communities and so forth. So it was really, it was almost reflecting on what he would probably go into in much more depth at the State of the Nation address that's going to happen in February. But you're right, there was a 6-point priority plan, action points, etc. But for me, I think the real criteria now in a pre-election year, and where the ANC is necessarily fighting for survival at the polls, he kind of hinted very interestingly about coalitions and the sustainability and viability of coalitions, and how they can actually become quite a difficult terrain, and they could also become quite imploding for coalition partners. But in this pre-election year, and where the campaign will start to emerge around the 2024 national and provincial election, you want to actually see the action points have some kind of target, in a sense. So while there were action points, they were also broad. So between now and 2024, until the next election, the question remains is, what if you don't achieve that? What is going to be the kind of benchmarking around which you're going to say, well, we haven't achieved it, and this is why we haven't achieved it, and how do you go forward in terms of saying, well, we're holding ourselves accountable? Because this is the ruling party that's hosted its own organizational event, and it's celebrating its 111 years of existence, that has to also hold itself accountable as the government in power.
It's going to be a tricky next few quarters for the party, because they do come out of a period of a lot of belly gazing. I think that's the right term. Lots of focus on what was happening inside the party, because obviously we know about the huge amount of faction fighting and the very intense lead up to the elective conference in December. And now it's almost you get the sense that there's an opportunity to now look up and say, oh my goodness, the 2024 elections is just around the corner. And that's why I thought it quite interesting that close to the end of his speech, and you've just mentioned it there, where he spent a bit of time speaking about how one of their focus points is going to be to have to get as many young people as possible registered. And he admitted to what a worrying trend low voter turnout is, because that has really impacted the ANC probably the most out of all of the parties. Do you think that perhaps gives us an idea that they are now looking up and they realize the vast challenge that lies ahead, that not only do they have to get their house in order, but they need to get more South Africans to actually believe that they deserve another chance?
Yeah, it's going to be a daunting task. I mean, one is to make sure that you keep your voter base. So the current voter base that you have, you keep that. But you also got to remember attrition happens between elections. So even from the last election in 2021, where local government elections showed that the ANC was actually teetering in terms of its performance. And we saw this in the big metros, where it basically had to either think about being opposition or where it has to actually hold in terms of a coalition. So it's not winning outright majority. So even in terms of where it is buffering in terms of its election performance, and it's holding on to a very, very vulnerable base of election voters and electorate. It also has to worry about what happens to those voters who leave. How do they actually, where do they go? How do they stay? What do they do? And then how do you bring new voters in onto the roll for your election? So it's really not just a renewal of the party, as the president has emphatically said in his 3 interviews today across the 3 major news stations, but it's also about how do you maintain that level of confidence, intrigue and dynamism with regard to the party, and making sure that the party remains relevant for people who want to come into the electoral process and say, I want to actually vote for this party. So I think it's all that kind of juggling in the air, and also being the ruling party in power. And it's a daunting task, to juggle these many different facets of your renewal, because your renewal is not just hinged on your internal organizational issues. It's also anchored in the fact that you have an election where where polls are predicting, and possible speculation is coming out that the ANC won't necessarily, go below 50%. But if it does, it may just manage to scrape a 50% or not. So these are critical questions. So you have a national election, but you also have a provincial election. And we can see something maybe fundamentally shifting in the provincial election, where there could be a possibility that in provinces you don't hold on to those provinces. I mean, KZN is one of those that's cited in terms of the inroads that the IFP is making.
Do you think, how he's laid out what the action plan is going to be, do you think there's a realization that they're now dealing with an electorate that has matured? We've now been living in a democracy for more than 2 decades. They've matured, they've fatigued. If you look at the low voter turnout, and we're moving into a stage where people are now voting, paying more attention to how their vote affects their day-to-day lives. What service delivery, impact on service delivery, impact on education, and no longer looking just at these broad political policy statements being made by a figurehead at a national birthday party in different provinces every year. Do you think that the ANC will find it difficult heading into the next election, making promises that people will believe at local level, and then having to almost dust aside their very bad record of service delivery going forward? Do you think the ANC will be successful in saying, give us a chance to ensure that your potholes are full, that your litter is picked up, and indeed that your electricity is turned on?
I think the electorate has always been sophisticated. I think they've always managed to gauge and assess how their interests are being attended to when it comes to voting, in terms of the period between elections, whether we talk about national, provincial elections, and the intervening period between local government elections. And I think this has always been part of the mindset of the electorate. Whether we talk about the electorate in South Africa or we talk about the electorate anywhere else in the world, we actually need to understand that the electorate assesses and gauges what they want to do. And if their interests are not being attended to in the way that now we see the implosion of the crisis, the socio-economic crisis, the service delivery crisis, the number of protests that we see happening, I mean, these are all benchmarks and indicators of what is precisely the crisis that is currently prevailing in the country in terms of the issues that you mentioned. So I think at the end of the day, you will get those loyal voters, but then they also are finding that they are caught in a dilemma. And the question is, where do they go? Do they stick with the party, or do they actually not go out and vote? And that becomes another kind of crisis for the party as well, because they're not maintaining even that small electoral loyal vote base. And I think in many ways, South Africans are very much, the South African electorate has always been about understanding what is happening in their community, understanding how the vote translates into tangible benefits, tangible impacts and action plans. And I think it's not lost on the South African electorate now, even the younger generation that's coming into the electorate, into the voter base, which we'll have to watch for and see the 18 to 24-year-olds, etc., how they are basically registering and are they actually seeing the confidence in this democracy. It's going to be important for us to understand that this is going to be a critical dimension that people have. It's the vote. And we saw this in the local government election. And I think we're going to see this again in terms of the next election 2024. So I think let's not underestimate the electorate. They're very much aware of their circumstances, both in terms of material and as well as lives and livelihoods. And if they are now going out and they're doing their own service delivery, rehabilitation and refurbishment, filling out potholes and creating their own community policing forums and taking care of their communities in terms of safety, security, etc., then of course you have to ask yourself, how much of confidence do they have in the state? And I think this is not just only for the ANC, but we have to look at across the political party spectrum.
Last question before I let you go. The President and many others at the 111th birthday celebration this weekend made reference to the implementation of the roadmap to Vision 2032. But what I want to ask you is what that roadmap looks like inside the party. What are the power dynamics within the ANC that you're going to be keeping an eye on over the next few years? Is it perhaps Ramaphosa versus Mantashe? Is it Mashatile versus Mbalula? I'm asking you to look into the looking glass of what the key power dynamic relationships that you're going to be keeping an eye on, especially in the top leadership of the ANC as we move ahead into this next chapter.
I think I'm going to be looking at 2023. I don't think I'm going to go beyond 2023 because the dynamics are so kind of fluid and they're manifesting and they're constantly evolving in such critical ways. So I think the first kind of 6 months of the ANC in 2023 is going to be critical. And it was referenced in the President's address yesterday where he spoke about the implementation of the Zondo Commission recommendations. And this is quite important. I think we have to also realize that there are serious dilemmas in the party when it comes to state capture. Even in his interviews today, he kept referring to the internal dynamics of people who brought the party to where it is now in terms of its own existential crisis. And I think this is where we have to think about what's going to happen. And of course, it's going to be critical as well, because he's talking about bringing the tripartite alliance partners also having a role. And if you listen to the COSATU head who spoke yesterday at the celebrations, talking about the fact that you can't forget workers. And so this is going to be a critical year. And I think before we move to the roadmap to 2024 or to 2025 or post 2025, we have to look at this year because it's an instrumental year for the party in terms of where it goes, in terms of its governance, in terms of its political leadership. But most importantly, can it juggle renewal while still being a party that is in power at the current moment?
Okay, always great chatting. That's political analyst Sanusha Naidu.